Hi, and welcome to Preparing for Implementation of the Dyslexia Law and Guidebook. My name is Jackie Jacoby, and I'm with the State Support Team in Region 1. I currently serve in the role of the Urban Literacy Specialist. For today's topics, we're going to look at what really is dyslexia. We're also going to look to understand the intent and requirements of House Bill 436, which is Ohio's dyslexia legislation. As many of you may know, adjustments to that legislation has taken place recently and was reauthorized under House Bill 583. From there, we're going to take a look at Ohio's Dyslexia Guidebook. And I just want to make a note before we get started that this presentation is serving as an overview. Feel free to share it with your teams, any leadership, but please also know that in addition to this overview, individuals implementing and making choices and decisions about the dyslexia legislation should read over the House Bill requirements in addition to Ohio's guidebook in full. So some dyslexia facts. We know that dyslexia is a learning disability that is neurologically based, meaning that it is happening in the brain. Dyslexia can cause difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition. And also there may be signs of poor spelling and decoding. Typically, there's a deficit in phonology, our ability to hear different sounds. And we also know that dyslexia is not related to one's cognitive ability. To get a full definition of dyslexia, you can visit the International Dyslexia Association, also abbreviated as IDA. In addition to dyslexia definition, you can also get quick fact sheets and other resources for teachers as it relates to literacy instruction. So before we really get into the guidebook, what are we hearing? We're hearing a lot from the field. Anytime we bring change up, we have a lot of questions and a lot of maybe need for clarity. So for example, some of the things that we're hearing is, well, this legislation is not funded, so it won't be monitored, so we don't have to put like a ton of attention to it. Heck, we could just give it to the special education department and let them handle it. We also might get some pushback as it relates to dyslexia or not. Kids are far behind as it is, so they're not going to catch up. We also might hear that we don't really have time to read that huge guidebook, or how is this really different than third grade reading guarantee? Anytime something new comes about and change is required, we might face some resistance. So as we go through this presentation, what I ask or challenge you to do is think about, what will your district or building's message be? What are you prioritizing? What might need changed in your system that is a result of poor literacy performance for your students? And what do we need to get rid of? And what do we need to implement perhaps differently in order to, improve our literacy outcomes? So why would we even consider change? So we're going to look at why change should happen as it relates to implementation science. Then we're going to look at Ohio's realization of this need for change and get a bigger overarching idea of some of the common, concerns that we're seeing across the state. And then we're going to apply that to the lens of this legislation and see how these two things parallel. So when we're considering change, we can ask ourselves these three questions. Does our current evidence show that what we are doing isn't supporting all learners? Has research from the field changed? And is there evidence that a more impactful strategy is available? And when Ohio the department went through and answered these questions, they found that there are things that could change and that we're currently not providing supports and services for all of our learners. So what Ohio did is at the start of its literacy initiative was put together Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. And that plan was derived by some deep data dives that resulted in some primary root cause analysis. So the purpose of this root cause analysis is to find what's happening. Why aren't our kids, meeting the literacy marks that they should be? Why is it happening? Why did it happen? And what needs to change because of it? So we're going to quickly go over the 5 primary things that Ohio identified as being a root cause for literacy underperformance. Now, when I talk about this, I'm going to talk about it through the lens of a collective we, right? We're not saying that all of these root cause reasons are, perhaps weaknesses at your location. However, collectively across the state, there are root causes that we're seeing time and time again across all settings, across all demographics. So please know that this is not, attempting to tell you what is all wrong, but instead to lay the foundation of what can help maybe your leadership teams as you make decisions for implementing the legislation moving forward. So the first thing that we've recognized and identified is learners who start behind stay behind. Even though a child can make 1 year's worth of growth over one school year, students who begin kindergarten academically behind generally remain behind. We also know that our district infrastructures and support for educators is a challenging thing for us to be effective about. Specifically, districts have lots of responsibilities, and our leaders are experiencing initiative overload. Larger districts are less likely to have the supports that teachers need to be effective. Districts often lack systems and structures that effectively plan for and implement evidence-based literacy instruction. We oftentimes use multiple programs, and then we don't really know how or when to monitor those practices to ensure fidelity. And then due to limited funding, our children oftentimes lack access to early childhood, which can affect the readiness for kindergarten and help with those earliest introductions to literacy development. We also know that we're struggling with some instructional practices and, the best ways to be effective with these practices. We found that using outdated special education services and supports and intervention practices are just not effective and aligned to research. We're lacking differentiation in all tiers of our instruction. We unintentionally continue interventions when progress is not occurring. In addition to that, we lack effective ways to monitor that progress. And then collectively, to no fault of our own, we have a limited understanding of how to build those early literacy skills in young children, which in turn, there is a lack of deep knowledge on those standards and what they really mean and what they should look like, particularly those foundational reading skills standards, what they should look like in our instructional practices. We also know that we can struggle with some district and building culture issues. Buildings and districts are lacking collaboration across departments, especially in special education and general education. There's not a collective belief that all children can learn and that all educators can teach. Having that disposition is crucial for any improvement to take place or new change initiative to occur. And then, our overall implementation efforts lack that proactive planning. And then finally, family knowledge and involvement. Many of us have these family engagement activities that we do, but we don't maybe know how to effectively and appropriately leverage our parents and families as partners in our literacy efforts. So we need those meaningful connections and partnerships, and we're just kind of lacking there. So Ohio identified these areas of concern, and then from that, what can we do? How can we make some changes? So let's take a quick look at the intent of Ohio's dyslexia legislation. The overall intent being a preventative and equitable approach to ensure literacy for all. This is something that is not currently being seen across all of our districts in the state. And, this legislation and the intent behind it is a great opportunity for us to, begin to improve outcomes and ensure equal access for all. So what we're going to do is just turn to one of our experts. Well, this is a video from a teacher. She presented to our State Board of Education. She does a 5-minute overview of why this structured literacy component, which is kind of like the bedrock of this dyslexia legislation, if implemented effectively and correctly, how it can improve outcomes for learners. So let's just turn it over to one of our teachers.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Carrie Williams, and I'm a teacher in Upper Arlington schools. And I think we all know with the sub shortage, what a feat that was to get here today. But my administration felt that it was extremely important, and as do I. I will be brief, I will be clear, and I will try to be succinct and explain why I'm here today. I'm a literacy specialist for kindergarten through 5th grade. I'm on the front lines every day teaching our most at-risk learners how to read and write. I am here because your decision will impact our children and impact us educators. I am here because I'm in a very unique position. I have been highly trained on both sides of these so-called reading wars. I know both worlds. I speak both languages. I've had the fortune of teaching in 5 very different districts. Very affluent, very low income, districts with enormous resources and districts with no resources. I've taught in the North and I've taught in Southern states. I've been teaching in Upper Arlington for the past 14 years as a literacy specialist, where I'm deeply honored and humbled to be the Upper Arlington 2020 District Teacher of the Year and was nominated for Ohio State Teacher of the Year. And I tell you this because what I'm about to share with you is, I think, one of the reasons that happened. As a literacy specialist teaching the most at-risk learners how to read and write, it is imperative that I use the most appropriate, scientific, evidence-based instruction. I do not have time to waste. My job is to prevent children from wrongly being identified as learning disabled. If 90% of our first graders receive appropriate prevention and instruction, they will be able to reach grade level. If not, 75% will continue to struggle throughout their years. In addition to teaching at-risk students, I work closely with our Director of Curriculum and Instruction, and I provide district-level training each year to staff, administrators, and parents on the science of reading and structured literacy, as my district is making a seismic shift away from balanced literacy and whole language due to ineffective outcomes in some district lawsuits. Teaching in these different districts and in different roles has provided me with enormous perspective. I know reading problems do not discriminate. Race, gender, color, rich, poor, doesn't matter. Reading problems are persistent, pervasive, and permeate our classrooms. I know there is inequity in services for our poorest children, rural children, and children of color. I know reading is a civil right. More than 60% of inmates are functionally illiterate. For the past 30 to 40 years, our reading scores nationally have remained low and have not improved. But the good news is that research suggests that 95% of our children could be reading proficiently with appropriate prevention and appropriate instruction. When we know better, we do better. I now know better. As I said, I've been trained on both sides of this debate. I've lived on both sides, and I can speak to both sides. My feet were firmly planted in whole language and balanced literacy for years. I followed the approach to a T, exiting most of my students, and I noticed that many of them were qualifying for special education 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. Why? I don't know how this was acceptable. I could not understand what I was missing. So I also observed that statewide there was a national trend of children receiving the same services being over-identified as learning disabled and being placed in special education as well. I knew that we as educators were missing something. There had to be a better way. I knew the children were not disabled, but maybe something else was. So my personal journey to what I call enlightenment began about 7 years ago. I began reflecting on my practice in search of better outcomes for my students. I received training based on the science of reading, and I dove into the research, a lot of research, especially research on how the brain learns to read proficiently. I immersed myself in the work of linguists, psychologists, the work of cognitive neuroscientists, Dr. Marianne Wolf, Dr. Stanislaus Dehaene, Dr. Mark Siedenberg, Dr. Nadine Gabb. I learned what was missing. The greatest thing about these neuroscientists, they have no dog in the fight. They're brain researchers. Last week at a national literacy conference in New Orleans, the famous French brain researcher, Dr. Stanislas Dehaene said, "There are no reading wars. You either understand the research or you don't." Some of the most important work that has propelled him to be one of the most sought after speakers internationally at this moment is the seminal work of Dr. David Kilpatrick, psychologist and researcher, with his book, Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties. His work has sent reverberations around the world. Dr. Kilpatrick identified one of the most profound pieces of research to be illuminated in recent years. He shares how words are learned, what sub-skills are needed to learn words, how words are stored permanently for instant word recognition. And let me say this very clearly, this is the hallmark of proficient readers, the permanent word storage that they can retrieve for permanent and instant word recognition. He shares what teachers were unaware of. We do not store words visually. That was a mind blower. It is not intuitive to think this because while the input is visual, it is stored phonologically in the auditory processing part of our brain. Reading difficulties are not vision problems. That's why deaf children, on average, leave high school reading at only a 3rd or 4th grade level. They can see just fine. What they can't do is hear the sound structure of our language.
Ms. Williams, you're at the 5-minute mark. If you can summarize the intent of your...
I absolutely will.
Thank you.
I want to know this leads me to the million-dollar question, why all the resistance? Where is this coming from? And I can tell you why. It's because teaching is so deeply, deeply personal. It's hard for people to admit that what they've been pouring their hearts and souls in could be incorrect. But if we are willing to follow the research, follow how the brain learns to read, I believe that we can help teach all of our children, up to 95% of them, to have access to a literate future in a literate world. So I'm here before you with the ability to telling you that I hope we have the ability to stop over-identifying children as being learning disabled when in reality, it could be our instruction that is disabled. And if we approve the Dyslexia Guidebook, which I have read, and I think it's very good, I believe we can follow the science and research to ensure our children, all children, rich, poor, boy, girl, black, brown, white, children in Northern Ohio, Southern Ohio, and every district in between have access to a literate future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williams.
Very powerful message she shared there. Before we move on, our next thing is we're going to dive into all the components of House Bill 436. But I just invite you just to pause for a moment and think back to what the intent of the law or what the intent of this legislation could do to improve outcomes. And as she said so eloquently, the heart and souls of our teachers are deeply, deeply invested in our children. And so it is hard work to make change. So knowing what we can do with the guidance of Ohio's Dyslexia Guidebook and knowing maybe where your staff is and where you are possibly in your literacy and reading journeys, whether you're currently an all balanced district or building, or if you're starting to embark on a structured literacy program, just take a moment and jot down some ideas of what you want your local message to be as you begin to talk about implementing the requirements of this legislation. Thank you for taking a second to do that. Now that we kind of have our dispositions focused on, which way we might angle and approach this work, let's dive into the different components of this dyslexia legislation. So we made this graphic here for you to kind of give you a visual of the components and how the dyslexia law is intended to support our current systems, or be embedded or, possibly change some of our system-wide practices. So here in the middle is the overall intent of this legislation, right? A preventative and equitable approach to ensure literacy for all. Every kid, regardless of placement, means all, okay? And then the legislation itself has a component or a requirement for Ohio to create a dyslexia committee. It has a component about professional development requirements for teachers. It has a structured literacy certification process that districts have to create. And then it has screening measures, Tier 1 dyslexia approved screening measures, in addition to some guidance for Tier 2 screening measures. All of these components, if implemented effectively and correctly, should be supported by an infrastructure or your current infrastructure for school improvement. So whether or not you're using Ohio's improvement process or a different possible structure, really think about bringing this legislation through your current school structures. In addition, in order for all of this to work, we have to have that solid Tier 1 structured literacy for all learners. This dyslexia work can't work as a separate arm of the instruction that we have taking place. So we're going to break down each part of this, starting with Ohio's Dyslexia Committee. So what does the Ohio Revised Code, the legislation, say as it relates to Ohio's Dyslexia Committee? The Ohio Dyslexia Committee has one primary purpose, and the committee was to develop Ohio's Dyslexia Guidebook. Okay, we know that a final edition of this has happened. We also know that this has been edited due to those new adjustments under, I believe, House Bill 583. So we're going to look at what the guidebook is intended to cover. All right, so we have 4 main sections. The first section of this guidebook is best practices in literacy instruction. The second section is methods for screening, intervention-based assessments, and progress monitoring. Our third section is methods for intervention and remediation. And then we have a fourth section of the certification in structured literacy instruction. Each of these sessions are intended to be utilized for 2 purposes. Okay, so first, the guidebook is going to recommend best practices, right, for effective structured literacy across all tiers of support. It also is going to provide local LEAs critical information for successful implementation of Ohio's dyslexia support laws. So it's going to tell us what the laws are, what is required of you locally, but then they're going to say, and you know what, here's some ways to do it. So it's allowing us to step away from just compliance and checking that box or giving another assessment, et cetera, and really talk about what does this look like in an effective system. Now let's look at the next section. So we have the screening measure requirements. The dyslexia screening measures are spaced out on a timeline. So starting in 23-24, Tier 1 and Tier 2, this is a typo, Tier 2 screening requirements will begin. Then the department will release a list of approved Tier 1 dyslexia screening assessments. A list for Tier 2 screeners, or what we also might know in our educational jargon as diagnostics, will not be provided because diagnostics are kind of specific to whatever that Tier 1 screener might identify as a possible risk. I did want to mention, though, that in the guidebook, in Appendix B, there is an example of a Tier 2 screening measure. So what are the components of that have to be a part of this dyslexia screener? First, we know that we're going to get that approved list, but if you are kind of looking ahead, it would be helpful to know, right, what items are going to be assessed, and maybe talk to your vendors to see if maybe they have specific assessments to meet all of these. So across the top, we have our various grades K through 6 that are impacted by this additional screening measure. And then we have all of our skills that need to be assessed in order to meet the requirements for the dyslexia screener for Tier 1. So I'll give you a moment to look at this. There is currently a team of people from across the state who are looking at a variety of vendor assessments that applied for approval. And that team is working to basically check that each assessment has these components, but then also has other components of what we know makes a valid and authentic assessment. Now, what is the real difference between the Tier 1 and Tier 2 dyslexia assessment measures? When we talk about universal screeners, we are going to have that brief, standardized, technically sound. The results of the assessment are going to give direct indicators of essential literacy skills that might, be a strength or weakness for each individual student. They're given whole group usually by a classroom teacher. There may be components that do require some one-on-one facilitation, but they should be quick. The overall result of the screener should be predictive for future outcomes as it relates to research as well as risk. And then it should also include some type of measure for ongoing progress monitoring. We know that research tells us that screening should take place, universal screening should take place 3 times throughout the year, beginning, middle, and end, which a lot of you have already embedded into your practices. Now, a Tier 2 dyslexia screener, these are given to students who demonstrate a need or are at risk for possibly dyslexia tendencies. This specific screener is going to be linked to structured literacy instruction, meaning what the assessment provides is more specific direction for our teachers on really to hone in and focus their efforts on specific skill sets for instruction. These can be, though, standardized or informal, but we want to steer away from teacher-created Tier 2 screeners. We want to look for them to be curriculum-based, criterion referenced, or norm referenced, something to, provide it some validity. And then, like I currently mentioned, we select these diagnostic assessments to clarify instructional needs and to help inform us in our instructional placements and really get to specific problems that can relate in goal development for each individual. And our Tier 2 screeners, specifically when we have some of the dyslexia ones, should be administered individually. They might take a little bit more time depending on what, assessment you might be utilizing. And then we want to make sure that our Tier 2 dyslexia screeners are directly connected to those foundational and imperative language and literacy skills. So what is the timeline and what does this mean for you? Okay, we know that we have Tier 1 screening timelines, and that as a result of some of those outcomes, it will impact some Tier 2 facilitation. So starting in 23-24, once we have that approved list, you will see that our kindergarten students need to be administered a Tier 1 screener. Every single child, regardless of placement, regardless of any identified disabilities, and this needs to happen after January 1st, so that we can get, some of those foundational learning skills underway. Then for our 1st and 3rd graders, we're also only for the year 23-24 administering to all that same approved screener for those indicated grade levels. Then for our 4th through 6th, all students whose parents, guardians, teachers, etc. request administration of the screener should be provided the screener. Now, the idea is, as we move forward into 24, 25 and beyond, that, we'll only really have to prioritize those screening efforts for our kindergarten students after that January 1st date, knowing that then moving forward, we'll have a way of, identifying possibly students who are at risk, knowing that the intent of this is for preventative measures that will keep students from being identified possibly in the future. So then for all grades in that 24-25 school year and beyond, we can still administer that tier 1 screener as requested. Now, the only caveat is, what about our students that transfer in, right? We want to make sure that we are able to catch all of their needs as well. So for our students that are transferring into the district, we are administering that tier 1 screener to each student in K through 6 within 30 days of enrollment, unless that K through 3 screener has yet to take place, right? And I say K through 3 here because we know that in that first year of rollout, K through 3, all of those individual students will be assessed with that tier 1 screener. Then, as we move into the next year of implementation and that timeline, we'll then continue with the practice of any student who's enrolled within 30 days, if the screener has yet to take place, administer that tier 1 screener. Now, what if we administer that tier 1 screener? What does the legislation say we need to do if we have a student who's possibly identified at risk? So starting again in that 23-24 year and beyond, all students K through 6 who've been identified at risk with that tier 1 approved dyslexia screener will need to be progress monitored for up to 6 weeks. If the student is not demonstrating progress, we will need to administer a tier 2 screener, also known as a diagnostic. However, it is important to note that the district may administer a tier 2 screener to any student who they've administered a tier 1 screener to. So let's say, the at-risk indicators are, perhaps well below where the child should be performing, and you know that 6 weeks is a very long time just to progress monitor, and you want to get to a very diagnostic problem-based analysis to determine how to fill those gaps as quickly and as effectively as you can, then you could, let's say, jump from the tier 1 screener and then immediately move forward with that tier 2 diagnostic. Now, for our students in K through 6 who transfer, since we have not been providing them with their education thus far, you must administer a tier 2 screener in a timely manner for anyone who you've identified at risk based off of that tier 1 screener. Okay, the committee is recommending that you do that within 30 days of that tier 1, but we don't know how much time we have to waste, and that child is new to us, so we don't know what prior instruction that they may have had. So tier 1 for our students transferring in, gotta move forward with that tier 2. Remember, this is preventative. There's a sense of urgency in those early years that we need to make sure that we're on top of. So the legislation also has a component where parents, guardians, custodians, family members must receive information and communication, and this communication needs to be in writing. So specifically, if a student is identified at risk, caregivers need to be identified. If you are going to administer that tier 2 screener, you need to notify, not provide, not get consent, but notify them that tier 2 screener is going to take place. And once that tier 2 screener has taken place, you need to provide the results of it. In addition, once you might have determined that a child does have dyslexia tendencies, you will need to provide the following to all caregivers. Parents are great advocates and supports for literacy improvement, and we know that directly from research. So the more information we can give them about reading development, the better. We also should be providing them information that explains risk factors of dyslexia. What could happen if. We need to describe and provide a description of the evidence-based interventions that we'll be providing. as well as an explanation of how our local structured literacy program works, what it looks like, etc. This communication should be parent friendly. It should be rooted in, optimism through the lens of, not a deficit perhaps, but more as an opportunity to get these preventative measures underway right away, and then to acknowledge the parent as a incredible, important, fundamental part of ensuring this reading development takes place. Okay, so we've looked at Ohio's committee, what the law requires there, which really doesn't have much to do with y'all. We kind of have that work underway. We looked at what we're required to do as it relates to timelines for those screening measures for tier 1 and 2. Now we're going to look at the professional development requirement. So the professional development requirement says that teachers must complete 18 hours of professional development that aligns with the guidebook. Okay. PD must be provided from one of the approved trainings. So ODE has a list of approved vendors or programs, organizations, etc. For example, Letters or Orton Gillingham that meet these requirements. We know that ODE will be providing a free online course that will meet the specified requirements. The department does have a list of what what all the topics will be on that outline course, and we should be hearing about that come fall 2022. So these 18 hours must take place. If somebody has already completed 18 hours of training from one of the approved vendors or programs, then they can be grandfathered in, right? So we can spend time now determining who already has maybe some professional development that meets the needs of this 18 hours, or make decisions on if we want all of our teachers to take the ODE training to get everyone on the same page, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the types of discussions you can be having at this time while we wait for that online module series to become available. Now, when that House Bill 583 came out, there was some clarity provided along or as it relates to the definition of teacher for the dyslexia legislation. So as it relates to the professional development requirement, the 18 hours does not apply to teachers that provide instruction in fine arts, music, or physical education. Okay, this does not mean that those teachers cannot partake in this, but it is not a requirement for those individuals. So when we say teacher, we're talking what you might typically call your general education teacher, your special education teachers, your Title I teachers, reading specialists, literacy coaches, etc. So when do we need to start with doing this professional development? Okay, so starting in 23, or at the beginning of 23-24. So when that school year starts, all of your teachers in grades K through 1, including special education teachers, including Title I teachers, need to have training completed, that 18-hour requirement. So that means that over this next school year, 2022 through 2023, they have that year to get those 18 hours completed so that when the following school year starts, they would have met that professional development requirement. Okay, so then the next year, during 23-24, you're going to have your teachers of grade 2 through 3, including special education teachers, reading specialists, etc., complete that professional development so that when the school year 2024 through 2025 begins, all of those teachers have met that 18-hour requirement. That same notion can be applied to the following year, 25-26, but the specificity, I don't know how to say the word exactly at this moment, of the role really does change. So for teachers who are providing special education in grades 4 through 12, will have to get those 18 hours completed by the beginning of 25-26. Now, does that mean that you have to wait in order to complete the 18 hours? It does not. Okay, so if you have, let's say that you're in a smaller community school and you do a lot of your trainings together, especially perhaps in, K through 3, and you all want to walk through those modules together, absolutely, by all means, you could do that. Once again, to reiterate, while there is not this requirement for this professional development for fine arts, music, and physical education teachers, it does not mean that they cannot take the training. They may do that. We know that literacy is embedded in all components of everything, absolutely everything that we do, from math to science to social studies, and that extends with the same logic into our elective areas and areas for additional development outside of our quote unquote academic setting. Okay, so we've chalked off what the legislation says for the committee, what it says about screening measures, and what it says about professional development. Now we kind of get to this last component of the requirement for districts to develop a structured literacy certification process. This is different than the special or the professional development 18-hour requirement. The structured literacy certification process is something that districts will need to create and have available for teachers in whom they determine should hold this certification. So the structured literacy certification process, what the law tells us is that districts must establish a structured literacy certification process for teachers providing instruction to students in K through 3. This does not mean that every teacher needs to be certified. It'll be a local decision on who you want to fill this role, how you want to fill this role, who will monitor, who has this certification, etc. And the guidebook does a very nice job of providing districts with details on how to, or details, suggestions, etc., on how to walk through the process of creating a certification. Now, this section, there are some additional documents that the department has put together that include approved programs or vendors, organizations for meeting the certification requirements. Okay, so right now, the focus for you all is throughout the 22-23 school year, developing this structured literacy certification process. So that's for the 22-23 school year. So as previously mentioned, Ohio has a list of appropriate certifications. I just want to take a quick look at this document. It is rather lengthy. It's 12 pages long, but the reason why I want to look at this is they recognize the following as appropriate certification. So there's independent training programs as well as some higher education programs that the International Dyslexia Association has deemed accreditation plus. And that accreditation plus is the important thing I just want to draw some attention to. So the Academy of Orton-Gillingham, we know that OG has a process that you can take to, one, components of it could go towards your 18 hours. However, they have this plus here. This plus means that, and what makes the certification different is that it adds this extra layer of implementation, like a requirement for, utilizing these practices and monitoring them as you go through to really not just learn about the knowledge like you do in your 18 hours requirement, but to take it a step further. Okay, can we implement this? How do we progress monitor? What do we need to switch based off of what our data tells us? That's what that certification process is going to do. It's going to provide you more expert guidance on how to effectively identify student needs, but then what to do about it in your instruction and, how to monitor it. So you'll see not all programs are going to have that accreditation plus. That accreditation plus is specific to the literacy certification, and The other accreditations are lists of independent programs or higher organization or higher learning organizations that will be considered approved for meeting that 18-hour component. Okay, so these two things are different. So when we're thinking about what does it mean to create a certification process, we need to determine the role of the certified educators on your teams or in your buildings. Do we want them to be, more instructionally focused? Do we want them to monitor more the systems level and support as needed? It's going to really look different. So you'll have to identify and recruit educators for the role once you determine what you want that role to look like, right? Then you can develop your own internal training process that you can use then to retain certified educators to, make perhaps job embedded for certain roles. A lot of that is local control. So ultimately, going back to our original question, what is the intent of this legislation and what is our message going to be? Why do we have this guidebook when usually we just have, X, Y, or Z laws that we need to follow? And so how can we take this legislation and do something different with it? We've had legislation changes over so many years. And how this one looks different is ensuring that as we're implementing and being compliant with the law, that it is supported by a structure for school improvement. If we can embed, these requirements into our school improvement efforts, we'll be able to monitor if we're doing it effectively, if our screeners are being utilized to drive instruction, etc. So what flip do you need to take as a leader as it relates to explaining upcoming requirements and how it impacts teachers? Because teachers cannot do it alone. We can't put this in the hands of teachers. It has to be a joint effort. So in final reflection, implementing this might seem very simple, might seem, like quite the feat. But is it a priority for you moving forward? And the way that you can decide that is simply ask yourselves, are all students reaching reading proficiency? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, this guidebook is a wonderful way to lead you to some effective science, evidence-based, rich instructional practices that will be beneficial for all students. Then maybe ask yourselves, what part of your policies, practices, processes needs to be adjusted to make change, impactful change? We can't just put these new requirements on top of our existing practices without recognizing what practices might already be ineffective. We got to get rid of those, right? We can't keep doing the same thing with expecting different results. And then to reiterate one final time, what will your district or building message be in regards to House Bill 436? Are you going to focus on compliance and get through it? Or are we going to be those sympathetic leaders that's like, hey, I know it's one more thing, one more assessment, but, just do it and submit it and be done with it? Or are we going to, drive with that compassion and really talk about effective implementation, that something has to change and that collectively all of us have contributed to this in one fashion or another without that being our intent? The impact has been real and the impact has been big. So can our message be, let's be compliant by being effective and improving outcomes? I thank you so much for your time today. My contact information is on the next slide, but I wanted to take a moment to let you know that we have some universal supports available throughout the region. Level Up with Literacy is a newsletter that will be coming out bi-monthly, and it's full of system and instructional considerations, supports, and resources to improve literacy outcomes. And this year, we're going to, take a focus on what that can look like kind of through the lens of literacy coaching. Then we want to let you know that we also have our e-brief. It's how we, stay up to date with all of the region on the professional development and networking opportunities that we provide here at the SSD. And then just wanted to make a small shout out to our literacy network. It is full of some brilliant, amazing, critical thinkers who are compassionate and really dedicated to working on changing their, literacy systems to have more of a focus on structured literacy. And it's been going for 2 years. And our first session, the September 27th session, we're actually going to hear from 2 schools, one in a small, more rural suburban setting, and then one school district from an urban setting. And they're going to share how they switch their literacy efforts to align more to structured literacy, and they have the data to prove it. So even if you can't make all of these network dates, I highly, highly, highly suggest you come to this first kickoff day. Our sessions are going to be virtual. Each session is from 9 to 11, but this is really going to give us, we're going to hear from people from the field. Like, okay, we know all this stuff about the legislation. Now what? So we invite you to come. Please bring, your colleagues and other leaders across various departments. It's going to be, just truly incredible. And then there will be a time for you to ask questions. The remaining network sessions will be aligned to your needs, as well as, turning our focus towards implementation and what that looks like at the system and classroom level, and what we can do as leaders to really drive literacy improvement. I thank you so much for your time. Please don't hesitate to reach out. If I myself am not able to, provide the support, I will put you in the right direction. I do want to make a caveat that the Ohio Department of Education also has a dyslexia support page that you can utilize for frequently asked questions, as well as the contact information should you have any questions specific to the legislation. So I'm just going to go to the dyslexia supports part. You can access the guidebook electronically here. If you have questions specific to that, you can reach it here. And then here we also spell out the new changes made to the guidebook from that 583. I embedded these into, this overview. And then as you keep going, you'll see additional resources, as well as frequently asked questions. So I encourage you to take the time to do that. But once again, thank you so much. We very much appreciate everything you do every single day for kids. When we know better, we do better. And we're trying to do better every day. And we're here with partners to do it right alongside with you. Thank you.